Morning, everyone, and thank you for joining tonight's AeHIN Hour webinar. Please note that all microphones are muted throughout the meeting. And for comments, please use the chat box. Please use the questions box. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Raymond Francis Sarmiento. He is a physician scientist and is currently the director of the National Telehealth Center, National Institutes of Health, University of the Philippines, Manila. He is a clinical assistant professor of the UP College of Medicine's Medical Informatics Unit on data warehousing and data modeling and design. He is also the Terminology Services and HL7 FHIR expert for the Standards and Interoperability Lab for Asia. May we now call on Dr. Raymond.
Thank you, chat. I'm just going to click on to be able to share my screen. Please let me know when it is up. Can you see my screen now?
Still waiting po. There. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Clicked on the wrong slide. Okay. Thank you so much for everyone who have registered and is attending this webinar. This is the 101st AeHIN Hour webinar for the Asia eHealth Information Network, and it's my privilege to present real-world implementations in Southeast Asia. My presentation is entitled "The World on FHIR." I am Dr. Raymond Sarmiento from the Standards and Interoperability Lab for Asia. So just a bit about me. I'm a general medical practitioner, a researcher and a data scientist. I'm also the director for the National Telehealth Center, and I teach over the University of the Philippines College of Medicine. Previously, I was the U.S. National Library of Medicine Clinical Informatics Fellow and was part of the Public Health Informatics Fellow cohort for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention from 2014 to 2016. Learning objectives. By the end of the webinar, the participants should be able to describe the different models for exchanging health information, describe the challenges involved in health information exchange, define and explain HL7 FHIR, describe the benefits of FHIR, how FHIR can be used to build an interoperable EHR ecosystem, and to be able to give examples of implementations of FHIR in the Southeast Asia region. So let's just begin with the brief review of HL7 FHIR. So what is FHIR? It's an acronym. It stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. But more than that, it is a set of data models for healthcare. It's also a set of application programming interface or API specifications for exchanging data models. And it's also a set of tools and servers to build and interact with those APIs. FHIR is also a community and is under the umbrella of the larger HL7 International Group and is dedicated to making it easier to exchange healthcare information by using web infrastructure to solve problems about healthcare. FHIR is also a specification that is freely available on the web, and it adds healthcare knowledge to web standard infrastructure and describes how information exchange can be done in the healthcare space. It is a standard for a RESTful API-based access to healthcare records. Both read and write functions are supported. Different servers all provide the same API. A client can use different FHIR servers without having to rewrite all of their functionalities, and is able to connect the API to a wider context of health. So why HL7 FHIR? Why should you consider using FHIR and possibly change the way that you are exchanging your information or data models? So in a unified hospital data layer, the problem that we have is that there are multiple fragile connections between many systems. EHR database 1 is only usable or meaningful to be accessed and used by a few systems in a larger system that's part of an enterprise architecture. That is the same context wherein EHR database 2 resides also and is used, as well as EHR database 3. When you use or install a FHIR server on top of all of those databases, you have one consistent FHIR interface on all the systems wherein the clients are able to submit a request to the FHIR server and to be able to get that information from the multiple databases as it deems fit or as required by your request. International specification, this international specification defines the overall framework, and countries, regions, vendors, and institutions publish adaptations to local culture or regulations. Individual projects also use conformance resources to describe the project rules, such as terminology usage rules, rules about the elements, usage, content flows, definitions and extensions and constraints as part of FHIR profile. All of these can be published through this link, http://registry.fhir.org. So how does this actually help in creating an interoperable electronic health record ecosystem? Traditionally, we have the messaging model which focuses on broadcasting data from one system to another, which basically is a point-to-point system in order to connect the multiple systems and have the information be exchanged. A hospital information system that has electronic forms of orders that will need to be passed to the pharmacy information system. Those are what we have traditionally been exposed to or have experience with in terms of connections. The system, not the messaging model has as a way of notifying all systems when a patient is registered. You notify the lab system when lab tests are ordered, and you return the lab test result for storage in the hospital information system or electronic medical record. Here is a snapshot of an HL7 message. So this is the message header, the event, the patient ID, all the other fields and elements that are included. This is just an example, and no part of this actually refers to a particular patient in any particular health facility. But there's still other healthcare architecture models that are available, such as the document exchange, which is what the United States of America has in terms of the creating a health information exchange. Canada, especially in the province of Ontario, central repository model is being used, wherein there's a central database and all EMRs connect to it. The mobile app world also has an app model and uses OAuth as part of a secure authentication, and it's being used on smart on FHIR mobile applications. So let's first talk about the document exchange for the US of A. It's the document exchange model focuses on pushing documents from one provider to another. Usually it starts with a discharge summary and eventually moves into continuity of care documents. Clinical notes, letters, and reports are also included. Laboratory results, pharmacy prescriptions are also being used. There's a limited sense in terms of the practical workflows, especially for referrals, and the dominant standards. I believe most of the audience are familiar with this. Clinical document architecture, HL7. There's a direct protocol also, and there's also the SOAP protocol as part of web services. The second model is on central repository, wherein it focuses on building a repository that sits between the systems, whether in a national or jurisdictional function or within an organization. The repository collects data as it is produced and makes it available on demand. Large implementations of this can be found in Canada, Australia, and Europe. Very popular here in terms of standards that's being used is the XDS, or the cross-document sharing profile from IHE, or the integrating the healthcare enterprise. Version 2 and version 3 of HL7, especially V2.5. Those are the dominant standards for this repository model. And the third model is the app model, Smart on FHIR, with applications or apps or mobile apps being popular elsewhere. They have now started to invade the healthcare space. Recently, Apple has released an Apple Health app, which essentially allows a patient to gather or garner all of his or her medical records from multiple electronic medical records. Let's say you have a medical record that's part of Epic or Cerner or Geisinger Health System. You could pull all of your medical information from those EMRs into one singular repository, using FHIR, of course, into your Apple Health application. The dominant standards here are custom APIs that are being built and OpenM Health. Typically, the purpose is built with a narrow focus. It reduces the barrier to entry, with every doctor seemingly having some sort of familiarity or knowledge of someone who is able to help him or her in terms of application or mobile app development. But what are the challenges? So there are four major areas that pose challenges in terms of creating an interoperable EHR ecosystem. First will be the existing data models are too basic. Have you ever experienced being in a hospital wherein there are electronic information systems, or there's a hospital information system, but the discharge summaries or the clinical abstracts are still printed and then scanned and stored as a PDF in order to help them store them in a separate repository. That's something that I've seen in certain countries in Southeast Asia. Other data models that are beyond the basic type will be deemed too complicated, especially if you are a clinician only with no or maybe just a little bit of knowledge in terms of HL7. Those that are using clinical document architecture or CDA they have a hard time understanding that whole concept or process. Number two area will be data transport. There are different dominant standards for every purpose. Number three, and usually it's being seen only as an afterthought, but is very essential when you try to put them into context in terms of confidentiality, privacy laws that are in existence. They're often only system level. For the workflow, humans are complicated. So basically, healthcare is they are being used by clinicians and doctors, but the health information systems are extremely unique when you take a look at them. And if you are the sort of clinician who practices in different facilities, usually you will be exposed to multiple hospital information systems or electronic medical records that are available in that locality or wherever you are practicing. So those are the four major challenges in terms of the creation of an interoperable EHR ecosystem. So for the Philippines, in terms of pushing forward the agenda and basically advancing the practice of HL7, but more importantly and more specifically, the practice of the use of FHIR, what we did was to connect the RX box, which is a mobile biomedical device capable of capturing different biomedical signals, in this illustration or image, you will see that it is able to collect signals for blood pressure. There is also an electrocardiogram. There is also for the oxygenation level of the patient, the temperature of the patient. For mothers who are pregnant and who are having contractions, they and would want to also know the heart rate of the baby and what is the status of the baby. There we also have a peripheral sensor for that. So this device, we connected that to one of the 6 accredited electronic medical records by our local health insurance, which is it's actually the National Health Insurance for the Philippines, or the Philippine Health Insurance Corporation, and it is called the Community Health Information Tracking System. This is the list of interactions that we wrote as part of HL7 FHIR implementation guide. The part that we have in terms of creating the guide, we sort of we started with a 4-man team, and we installed FHIR through the Happy server. So if you go to happy.fhir.org, you'd be able to download and be able to understand how to install a FHIR server in order to test the interaction between your between the system that you're connecting, which is system A, into another system, which is system B. In this list of interactions, you will notice that, as I mentioned, the read and write functions, or the get and post functions, which is typical for FHIR, are essentially put into use here. So when the electronic medical record will try to read the patient queue, that is a get function, and will try to get that list of patients from RX box. That whenever there is a list of patients that are waiting to use the box, there is and there is also a connection between the two. So the read, search, which will be interactions 1 to 5, those are all get functions, and interactions 6 to 12, which are all create, those are post interactions, post functions. Those are essentially how you write the your requests from the client to the server. So we were able to successfully connect chips to our Xbox using HL7 FHIR. We developed also a testing protocol in order to test if all of these interactions are indeed correct. We set out in having a clinical use case to be able to see if this list of interactions or connections are deemed complete or appropriate for testing the connection between chips and our Xbox. And we were able to successfully complete everything, including writing the implementation guide, after 7 to 8 months of work. Recently, by middle of last year, I believe, we were able, the Standards and Interoperability Lab for Asia, using the HL7 FHIR implementation guide as a guide in order to connect the RX box to another electronic medical record system, such as the Philippine Department of Health iClinic SIS. It's an electronic medical record system developed by our Ministry of Health. We were able to successfully do the same thing, connect RX box to their electronic medical records. As of now, we have 2 to 3 requests for other electronic medical records to link to the RX box, which will, in the latter half of this year, will be deployed to an additional 1,000 rural health units, primary healthcare facilities all across the Philippines, which will bring its total deployment sites to over 1,200 sites all across the country. For Vietnam, as part of the team with Graham Grieve, who is widely acknowledged as the original architect and the father of FHIR, and also James Agnew, who is the lead, the technical lead and lead developer for HL7 API, or the Happy server. We have been helping the Vietnam Ministry of Health, their e-health administration, in terms of building the capacity and helping them with their national One EHR program, by that has officially adopted FHIR as the interface of or specification of choice to connect all of their systems. Here is a snapshot of the health enterprise architecture of for the Vietnam, for the country of Vietnam. I apologize. A lot of the I think all of these are in Vietnamese, so it will be very hard for me to understand. Although what I realize is that this HIV/AIDS box here points to all of the disease registries that are contained in this space. So in November of 2017, roughly 3 months ago, we had a face-to-face meeting of the Vietnam community, and we were able to learn how to use the FHIR or RESTful API to read and write patients and medical information. Those were essentially made up patients. We were just trying to test if those who we trained as part of the tutorial and as part of the initial connectathon will be able to do that, and they were able to successfully do that. We set out also into initiating the creation of a FHIR community for Vietnam. We also started with the creation of a national implementation guide for Vietnam, which will contain all of the national FHIR profiles for use. Discuss the use also of FHIR for the national electronic health record, electronic medical record, and make FHIR a pragmatic solution as focused on the community. As part of the November 2017 Connectathon, we tested the use of FHIR in Vietnam. We also have been working with specific key officials and personalities in order to support the national One EHR program of Vietnam, as I mentioned. And we also set forth into building the impetus and the social media presence so as to support each other as FHIR is adopted nationally in Vietnam. In terms of post-connectathon needs, the first one will be we have been tracking their progress on creating the HL7 FHIR community and continuing our support for FHIR for the country of Vietnam. We also identified the need to continue working on the candidate Vietnam National Implementation Guide. Later on, I will show a link to the guide in one of my later slides. And we also continued the discussion on the use of FHIR for national electronic health record implementation. They already have identified the baseline 21 EHR functionalities, which all EHR vendors and implementers and providers will have to have. For capacity building, we have completed a training of trainers recently, as last week, to build the Vietnam capacity to deliver localized training for FHIR. We will have a more actually a deeper dive in terms of FHIR understanding and training. As terminology services expert, also I'm leading the effort into terminology training and the goal is to set up their own national terminology service. We have been also assisting them in architecture planning and technical and developer training specifically for Happy, which is the FHIR API interface, will be one of our critical goals also. So how do you actually set forth into building a national profile as we have been helping the country of Vietnam? So how do you begin? It often starts with a use case or user stories and storyboards to be able to understand the clinical use case, and clinical user stories, wherein this data elements that will be part of the national profiles and you will have to define will be included. So a profile is essentially a definition of a particular specification that would contain that will be useful for a particular purpose or use case, with certain constraints or extensions, if you will, on the set structured definition for that particular profile. Number two, we try to define the behaviors. So when the patient gets registered and gets admitted, what will be the consequent behavior afterwards? Those are the things that, and as part of that consequent behavior of the other systems interacting, what data elements should be added or will be added or will be used. We often look at queries being sent all around the system, the workflow, if there are needed updates for services, and the data models that are going to be needed. Number three, and once you have the data model in place, you then need to map all of these to the FHIR resources. It could just be a simple Excel table, a simple CSV table. What you will do is try to identify these data elements, try to define them, and then try using a conformance resource based on that resource also, and based on a set of value sets that define the profile, or the value for that profile that will be part of the definition. You will need to validate or your mappings of these data elements to the particular FHIR resources. Obviously, when you set forth or start on mapping these FHIR resources, you will at times be surprised that there are certain mappings that are not exactly a one-to-one mapping or would not be needed for a particular use case. So those are certain tweaks that you will need to define by adding a constraint or extending your definition or putting in a certain set of value sets. So for example, in HL7 or FHIR, if you would want, let's say, for gender, to be able to capture not just male and female, but those who are unwilling to submit or that kind of information and will just want to put in unknown as a value for the data element gender. That's something that the national profile will have to accommodate or will have to include. And also, the national profile would need to be voted on and would need to be agreed upon by the stakeholders in the country. So there are certain concerns that are involved in terms of building a national profile. This includes national identifiers. Does your country use a national identifier or a national ID? Are there national code systems that are consistently used? For clinical codes, does your country have a SNOMED CT license? Does it, for laboratory codes or laboratory values, does it use LOINC? So those are the types of code systems. Or do you use ICD-10? Is your ICD-10 coding system mapped to the reimbursement claims system of your national health insurance system? Those are certain intricacies that you will need to add also. Specific additional patient information, such as if you are requiring information on race and ethnicity to be included in the profile, that's also part of it. Basic documentation is required, and it will be critical that that the governance committee or the governance of the community would provide directions or on the strategies on how to move forward. Um, in this slide, you will see the link for the candidate Vietnam National Implementation Guide as developed by and as created by Graham Grieve. You will notice that it is in Vietnamese. We have started to translate the words in the link into Vietnamese. But if you delve deeper, the value sets, as we have started into developing the profiles for this candidate implementation guide, they are still in English. If you click on the link. The HL7 affiliate is also being started with some formal organization needs in order to manage the Vietnamese National Implementation Guide. There's also a need to connect to HL7 international, and best way to do that is to be an HL7 affiliate and to identify candidates for the initial affiliate secretariat. Registration is underway, and we are helping Vietnam in this regard. So for the FHIR community, it's another great thing about it. It's large, it's helpful, and it's international. The focal point of this community is in Zulip. It is a stream or a chat group or multiple chat groups. Essentially, there is a particular stream for Vietnam, but there are also many others, especially if you are doing work on Smart on Fire. There's a Smart on Fire stream. If you're developing terminology service for Australia, that's a separate stream. For the Philippines also, there's a separate stream. So if you register and create an account in http://chat.fire.org, you will be able to be part of a large international community of fire experts all around the world. So thank you so much, and that is the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, please let me know.
Thank you, Dr. Raymond. We have our first question. It reads, where was the Happy server installed? Inside the RX box or inside the EMR?
So we initially tried several ways in installing the Happy server. We found that it was easiest for the server to be installed in the EMR itself, as data is essentially when the patient comes in. The first interaction for that patient will be registering that patient and having all of their vitals be collected or stored into place, and all of that data is initially stored or collected or recorded in the electronic medical record. If the data is being required, let's say the client is the box or the device, and you will want to pull out a specific record or transaction for that particular patient with a known patient ID for that facility, then that will be easy to pull out as you request from the client to the server.
Thank you, Dr. Raymond. Our next question is, does FHIR have mechanisms to guarantee that FHIR messages are not corrupted? For example, in some SMS apps, the messages get mangled. Does this happen with FHIR?
So what we try to do is try to add an additional layer in terms of connecting that request for a transaction um, between one user to another. We have not we're using the OAuth. Means we have I believe we have essentially bypassed the data loss or the mangling, quote unquote, that happens when there are messages that get transmitted. Essentially, the message travels through a secure protocol as a whole and not in bits and pieces. And when that message travels through, it is there is the integrity of the message is kept.
Our next question is, what are the enablers of a successful FHIR implementation in a country? Or what does a country have to do to have FHIR widely used?
Okay, so it normally starts with having a good governance structure.
It's very important. Like for example, in Vietnam, we have been very fortunate to be able to work with such strong-willed and dedicated Ministry of Health. Our stakeholders over there have a way of gathering opinions as needed from experts, both from industry and from government and from the academe, to try and come up with what will be the best way to move forward in terms of implementation. So most countries, there are a lot of experts in within a particular country, but having that critical governance structure in place and having that let's say that will in terms of implementing and having a firm direction in terms of which standards will be used, what kind of standards will be used, how to move forward with the use of these standards. Those are critical areas that we have found to be very helpful and meaningful in terms of national implementation. So just a caveat, HL7 is not an unknown concept in Vietnam. They have been using HL7 version 2 and version 3 CDA for the past decade or so. So they are essentially very skilled in HL7, but they found the benefits of using FHIR, especially in national scale. They have even had serious efforts put into the adoption of FHIR in terms of having all of their electronic medical records, submitting all of that data in aggregate form to a DHIS2 server, which and that will be done using a FHIR interface. So those types of efforts have been deemed successful, but the success will not come to fruition if the governance structure wasn't there in the first place. Secondly, having that enterprise architecture, having a defined enterprise architecture and having a way to view or visualize what you want to see for your own country. That was also a crucial way in terms of understanding how the different systems will be part of this whole let's say multi-pronged system, or that has multiple sections that are part of it. So those two things are very crucial. And another thing will be standards. Vietnam is working towards acquiring a SNOMED license to be able to help them with their clinical terminologies and to help them move all of their efforts outside of the research realm. Aside from standards, they have created a lot of working groups that would focus on a particular terminology standard. So they have a working group already for IC that focuses on ICD-10. They have one that focuses on LOINC, focuses on CPT, DRGs, those things that they have really invested in terms of implementation.
Thank you, Dr. Raymond. I would also like to invite our other participants to send in your questions. You can find the questions box near on the bottom part of the webinar application. All right, our next question is, what do you mean by need to map this to the FHIR resources? Can you give an example?
Okay, so there is what we call a conformance resource. The conformance resource is the one that validates if the data element has been correctly mapped to a particular FHIR resource. So if you have a FHIR resource that points to, let's say, this FHIR resource contains the values or the value set for gender, and let's say the Vietnamese term for gender is X, Y, and Z. You will need, and then for gender, there is also under it there is male and female. You will need to map that the male that you are referring to is the same male in the FHIR resource or the value for the value set under that FHIR resource that points to male. If you wanted to add as part of your national profile, let's say an unknown value, that's also something that you will need to include in terms of mapping that to that FHIR resource. So when you do that mapping, so male means male in this FHIR resource, female means female this FHIR resource, unknown means unknown this FHIR resource. But there should be a conformance document that actually validates that you correctly mapped male to male and not male to female or male to unknown. That you are able to map female to female and not female to male and female to unknown. So those are what I mean by mapping to FHIR resources.
All right, our next question is it possible for a WordPress-based web app to use FHIR as well?
So good question.
Yes, we have been able to connect that with using a WordPress
web-based application, although we haven't really seen a lot of those examples as of yet. We will love to work with you, and if you could be able to share with us your progress in terms of connecting, that will be extremely helpful for the community to understand that there's such a thing that exists in terms of implementations. A lot of the work has been on other web applications that have been written in Java. So we have been working on a lot of JSON files. That is not to say that we are, because HL7 versions mostly delve into XML, but that is not to say that we are putting aside the use of XML files. When you download Postman, it actually is able to accommodate both JSON and XML files when you have to specify a particular resource. But a lot of the work that's been done, especially if you are using the Happy server, it's most of them are in JSON.
Thank you, Dr. Raymond. Our next question is, where is the conformance resource inside the Happy server?
Yes. The conformance resource will be found in the Happy server. You just need to put in how do you put this? That validation resource inside the FHIR interface, so that whenever the client would request, the response will be either the request is valid and then it will give you the appropriate response for that particular request. So when a client sends a request to the server will need to validate if that response is first of all valid, and before it produces the response or the information, it spits out the information that the client is requesting from the server.
Our next question is, conformance research is a manual effort?
There are already conformance resources that are available in FHIR.org. So if you will want to import those resources, that will be easy on your part. But we would also would like to stress that you will need to check if the contents of the conformance resource are those things that you will need for your particular use case. So there are conformance resources that have been developed by the community, which may or may not be applicable to your particular use case. So it's also important to check if the contents of that resource are what you are actually looking for.
The next question is, can we have regional AeHIN FHIR profiles?
That's a good question. Although it's a difficult one in the sense that so multiple countries have I would believe or I would expect multiple national e-health governance structures, and there may or may not buy into fire adoption. That's one challenge. The other challenge would be the different use cases which may be inherently found or intrinsically found only in that particular country. Certainly, every country has their own set of rules, set of customs, set of traditions that basically flows into or affects or influences how healthcare is being provided or healthcare services are being provided in that particular country. Those two are the main challenges, but that is not to say that is implementing or creating or building a regional fire profile would not be helpful for AeHIN. Let's say for the whole of Asia, if there are use cases or let's say profiles that are universally common, I would say or I would expect within the Asia region, those will be the ones that will be included in the regional fire profiles. And then once they are part of it and once they are voted on by the AeHIN community, by and led by the AeHIN governance structure, then we will be able to disseminate it in terms of recommending that these are in existence. These regional fire profiles are in existence, and if you will want to use that or import that into your national implementation guide as you work towards implementing EHRs in your countries, that will certainly be helpful, especially for those countries that are searching for which standards will essentially or specifications would essentially be helpful for them to move or advance their EHR agenda forward and to move the needle much faster, if you will.
Thank you, Dr. Raymond. Our next question is, what is the role of WHO when it comes to helping populate the fire specification?
Hmm. Good question. So, I have not. I may not be the best person to answer that, but so I have not had any um, experience or have not had any interactions or exchanges with the WHO in terms of uh, having the fire profiles be populated. Um, I would imagine that the WHO will leave these types of decisions to the countries themselves in terms of implementations. The WHO has always had a recommendatory or advisory role in terms of releasing guidelines, let's say for what will be the best way in terms of creating an interoperable EHR ecosystem and something that's similar of the sort. But in terms of pushing forward a specific specification or particular specification like fire, I I may be wrong here, but I don't think that's something that the World Health Organization would want to go because, like I mentioned, I think they leave up that decision essentially to the national governance structure for each of the countries.
Thank you, Dr. Raymond. For those who still have questions, you can type your questions in the questions box. Alright, the next question is, if we limit the AeHIN fire profiles to aggregating data from fire-compliant EMRs, will that work?
Could you repeat that again? Sorry.
If we limit the AeHIN fire profiles to aggregating data from fire-compliant EMRs, will that work?
Yes, yes. So that will be so. The expectation is that
what we saw when you're trying to aggregate the data, let's say you have a FHIR profile, you're trying to aggregate all of the data that's being collected by the electronic medical records, having them submit to the district or to the national registry, or essentially a repository that your Ministry of Health will require, and you will want to submit all of that, um, let's say, to DHIS2, using the FHIR specification. That is absolutely doable, and that is what we are doing and helping Vietnam in terms of making that into reality.
Thank you, Dr. Raymond. I think that is the last question from our participants.
Okay, so thank you so much for everyone, and for those who have registered, and for those who particularly have attended this AeHIN hour. As I mentioned, this is the 101st AeHIN hour, and I hope you were able to learn a lot in terms of HL7 Fire and how Fire has been growing, no pun intended, in terms of implementations in the Asia region, and but more specifically in the Southeast Asia region. So we are hoping that we'll be able to help other countries, especially AeHIN member countries, um, and those who have a particular appetite for fire implementation and adoption in your countries. Just please drop us a line or send us a message, and we'll be more than happy to help your country in addressing this need. So thank you so
Okay.
much. I think that's the end of it, Charisse.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Raymond. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, and please join us for the next AeHIN hour next week. Thank you so much. Bye.